As I consider the whole question of what sort of template is best to follow in establishing a new Buddhist organism or tradition, I think I've been going about it the wrong way for the last 5 years, because I've been looking at how Buddhism has perpetuated throughout Asia. But I think a better example of how it might happen is in my own spiritual roots and tradition, which is Irish, Catholic, Celtic spirituality of the 5th to 9th century. That might actually be the template that we might need to use for establishing a new Buddhism in wilderness and frontier lands. Is looking to Irish Celtic Christianity's development and growth into a unique tradition a better way or a better example to look at instead of a traditional Buddhist one? Well, I think there is a case that the answer is yes. In the previous episode, I talked about sort of the coming about of Christianity in Ireland and Japan as two examples that ended up with radically different results, as an example of what is needed and what might be needed to establish a new Buddhist tradition in lands that are sort of outside mainstream Buddhist influence, certainly in Asia, but more people that live in Canada and certain parts of the United States, Africa, Europe, etc., that are not near or do not have ready access to what one would coin a Buddhist infrastructure. I remember hearing a story when I started practicing Soto Zen of an American who went to Japan and spoke to a prominent monk there and said, "Hey, would you ordain me so that I can practice Japanese Zen Buddhism?" And the teacher said, "Why? Why would you want to do that? Why don't you go back to America and establish your own Buddhist tradition?" So the idea of establishing a localized Buddhist tradition is not that crazy of an idea. Actually, in lands where Buddhism is the predominant spiritual tradition, it's more in places where Buddhism has been transplanted that it seems to be a bit of a controversial idea. And in this episode, I want to talk a little bit about the Irish example as a possible template that one could follow to establish a Buddhist tradition in areas that are sort of outside, that are at the edge of the world, if you would, edge of the Buddhist world. So let's talk a little bit about Ireland and the Irish Celtic Christian development that occurred from the mid-5th century and went up to the 9th century before Roman Christianity really came in and took over and established Benedictine monastic rules and that sort of thing on the Irish monasteries. So we begin with an idea, an understanding of what Ireland was at the time of the 5th century. A lot of people seem to think that all of Europe was sort of encompassed by the Roman Empire, where, as a matter of fact, that wasn't the case. Really, the empire sort of stopped at the, in terms of strong infrastructure, in England. And it was in very isolated pockets of England that there were strong Roman infrastructure. And that meant that the transplanting of the Christian church, which followed the boundaries of the Roman Empire, sort of stopped at that area of the world. Really, in northern Scotland and in Ireland, Rome never ended up there. So there was no Roman influence, and therefore also no established Christian tradition, even by the 5th century. Ireland really was seen as being at the edge of the world. It was seen as barbarian lands. It was seen as outside the Roman Empire, and as I said, outside sort of the infrastructure of both Rome and Christianity. It was believed to be inhabited by barbarians, and they were a rather violent lot, slave traders and tribal warriors and that sort of thing. And so it was a bit of a dangerous land, it was considered. And really, outside the influence of Rome and of Christianity. In Ireland at the time, there were no cities, either Roman or local, and Irish society really was tribal. It was based on local chieftainships of various clans, very localized. Most clans didn't have any more than 250, 300 people. Apparently at one time there was like 150 different kings in Ireland, looking out over the various clans. And so it was very different than sort of the Roman infrastructure, where there were cities, and in the Christian structure in those cities were the seat of dioceses, areas that sort of were under a particular auspice of a bishop to sort of govern over, etc. That was not Ireland at all. The landscape was entirely different than from the influence of where Rome had landed. And so in Ireland, like I said, it was tribal, it was local, and each local place had its own sort of customs that it adhered to, its own sort of practices that it adhered to. And in the 5th century, while there were, it's a mistake to say that there weren't Christians in Ireland. There were Christians in Ireland, but they were largely people that were brought to Ireland as slaves. And so the result is that Christianity, while present in the 5th century, it wasn't organized. It was practiced individually or in small groups of slaves. There was no churches, there were no monasteries, there was no infrastructure. And so really, you could say there wasn't really an organized Christianity. There were just some local practitioners, which sounds very familiar to many of us who are sort of on the fringes of, or at the end of what would call the Buddhist world. This really began to change, though, in the 5th century with a fellow by the name of Patrick, St. Patrick. That wasn't actually his name. He had a Latin name, but I'm going to say Patrick just because that's the most commonly known name, that the name that he was known by. And Patrick actually came from the north of England. He was likely of a Roman family living in England. His family had been one of his uncles, I think, had been a church priest. His father was a deacon, very attached to the Christian community, and so grew up in a Christianized sort of setting. And eventually what ended up happening is he got captured by Irish slavers, and he was sent to Ireland for a period of time. Eventually, he was there for a while, and eventually he was freed and ended up back in Britain. And while there, he just so happened, he knew that there were Christians in Ireland, and there was something in him that saw a land that had great potential to spread the gospel. And so somehow, probably through family connections, because he wasn't really of the peasant class, he was more of an upper class, he found himself getting ordained a bishop, which back in the day was a lot easier than it is today. Back in the 5th century, in the Roman, if you know anything about the Roman Catholic Church, there's this whole process being made a bishop. You have to get the Pope's approval and da-da-da-da-da. Like there's this whole rigmarole lest you fall foul of the Roman Catholic Church. That was not the situation in the 5th century. Really, it was up to local clergy and local communities to elect a bishop who would then be ordained as a bishop and able to ordain priests and deacons and sort of, perpetuate the community in a particular area. And so Patrick found himself in a position where he was actually ordained a bishop. And then, contrary to all advice that was given, he set sail right back for Ireland. And there's a bunch of stories about what happened when he arrived. He went to the land of the kings, and apparently one of his first acts was to light an Easter fire. And he was arrested and managed to explain the Christian tradition, and they let him go, and actually people started converting to this wild and crazy tradition called Christianity. There's a lot of myth that goes along with this, but there's probably some element of truth in that. Really, Patrick was a maverick, and he was seen as a maverick by sort of establishment Christianity and establishment, remnants of Roman society. Really, the act of returning to these quote-unquote barbarian lands was kind of frowned upon. And especially going there to convert people was really frowned upon. And going there to ordain people was really, really frowned upon. And he kind of got a bad name for himself, actually, back in the establishment of the church in England and in various other places as well. You have to remember at the time, Christianity was not sort of as, we often see today, where there's great missionary efforts and trying to evangelize the tribes in the Amazon or the people in the desert or whatever it is. Christianity was seen really as too good to be wasted on barbarians. So it was considered a bit of a waste of time and it would waste resources for Patrick to get ordained a bishop and then just zoom right on back to those barbarian lands and start establishing churches and monasteries and converting the local community. But he was a brave dude, and he understood sort of the potential that existed in Ireland. And he returned to there, and like I said, he started building the infrastructure of the church. Now, he probably had some followers that came with him, so it probably wasn't just him, but he was a bishop, and he had the means to light the fire to establish an Irish Christian infrastructure because he had the capability of ordaining others and baptizing and confirming and building churches and consecrating things and really developing community because he had that tie to the Roman Christian infrastructure through that ordination, and he used it. And so effectively, this one man lit a fire in Ireland that easily within 100 years became the dominant sort of spiritual tradition of Ireland and beyond, because his influence went beyond Ireland into Scotland, etc. Now, Irish Christianity, when it was first set up, as I said, there were no cities and there were initially no dioceses in Ireland. Really, Irish Christianity was centered around monasteries. And the monasteries themselves were actually sort of tied to the tribal clans, actually. And so the monastery would actually serve as the civitas, the city and the educational center and the means by which, markets were established and people could trade goods and blah, 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 blah. And so that was the structure of Irish Christianity. Bishops actually were I heard one historian said there was not a lot expected of bishops at the time. So there were no dioceses, and often bishops they'd send somebody off to get ordained a bishop to come back. They weren't necessarily even the abbot of the monastery. They were just one of the monks, and when they needed to ordain somebody, they pulled the bishop out of the ranks just to say, hey, can you ordain this person a priest? We need a priest. And that's kind of how it went. And it was much more fluid. It was much more dynamic than certainly the situations that, over time as things matured in the tradition and a bit more of a structure got put into place. It was much more fluid at the time. The other thing about Irish Christianity is that unlike in other areas under the Roman Catholic influence, where priests were what's called incarnated into a diocese, meaning they were fixed to a particular area, and bishops were the bishops of X area. Irish Christianity was a lot more fluid. It was a lot more flexible. And so clerics and monastics would actually spend time in a monastery, but then they'd leave and they'd go somewhere else, perhaps sometimes to serve a different community or set up a new community in an area that really didn't have anything of the infrastructure. And there was actually this whole thing in Irish Christianity called going into exile for Christ or going into exile for God, where these monastics or clerics would actually permanently leave their homeland to go to some remote, far-flung place, and they would stay there the rest of their lives, establishing a monastery, establishing a local community, to perpetuate sort of the Irish Christianity in lands that it hadn't been touched. It was highly missionary, highly mobilized, and highly flexible. There's in fact a story about Patrick that he came when he was walking one day. He came across this. It was actually a warrior, but it was a warrior that was sort of tending a flock of sheep. And after having a brief conversation with the guy, Patrick baptized him, tonsured him, meaning I don't know if he made him a monastic or ordained him as a priest or something, gave him a book of the Gospels and took off. And the guy was expected to sort of spread the gospel message. That was the fast and dirty of the Irish seminary back in the day. Wasn't a lot of training, it's sort of, you understand the message, this is the basic message, now go and preach. And by the way, go and preach and work to spread the message to other people so to see if they might be interested in following as well. So again, a very fluid, very dynamic way of doing things. One of the things, a few things that really made Irish Christianity different from other forms of Christianity of the age, again, it was location. It was highly independent. Although there were some threads of attachment back to the Catholic Church. And over time, actually, the Irish Church became revered for its copying of biblical manuscripts and scholarship and that sort of thing. There's the book called How the Irish Saved Civilization. The truth is that the Irish Church, it wasn't separate from Rome, and it would be wrong to say that it was in opposition to Rome, but it was different. They had orthodox teachings, but they had practices that did vary in the Irish Church based on local custom. So some of the more common ones were how the date of Easter was calculated, for instance. Some of the prayers were very unique to Irish literary styles and poetry. There were different liturgies and different practices for different monasteries. There wasn't sort of one touch point of a practice that all Irish monasteries and clergies practiced. There were certain key features that were the same in relation to the Mass, but a lot of the different practices, the other elements of celebrating the Mass would sometimes be very different from one monastery to another. And so it was very independent, and it didn't rely on the infrastructure of elsewhere. Some of that infrastructure had been, it was Patrick, like I said, who kind of started the whole thing with some of his compatriots, but it really, it really kind of was homegrown. So, some of the unique features that came from a tradition like that was it's estimated that within 100 years of Patrick establishing Christianity, Irish became the first European vernacular to be used in church rites and prayers. Whereas everything was Latin everywhere else, Irish actually became the first language to be used, the vernacular for religious purposes. So Latin was still used, but there was started in many books. There were actually glossaries that translated the Latin into Irish, for instance. That was unique to Ireland. Not a lot of places were doing that, and so that's a key feature of its independence. Clearly, Ireland had, in its root tradition, Ireland had very strong roots to the natural world. Like many other indigenous cultures, right? Certainly us in North America are aware of this, but also in other areas too, Africa, Asia, etc. The indigenous people tend to have a strong root in the natural world, are very attuned to the cycles of the natural world, and learn under its tutelage, its spiritual lessons and life lessons. The Irish were very much of this ilk. And one of the things that made Irish Christianity very different is that it had a strong sense of the goodness of the natural world. It also had a strong sense of the goodness of every person, whether Christian or not Christian. And one of the things that was unique about Irish Christianity is it didn't suppress a lot of the old traditions from the pre-Christian times. And in fact, it incorporated some of the practices in a Christianized way into Irish Christian practices. I think, and this is a bit of a supposition on my part, I think it's why even today in Ireland, there are traditions that are not of a Christian background, the fairies and, various things like that are not of a Christian background, but still are perpetuated down and even to some degree incorporated into Irish spirituality, even with the Catholic line that went down through the centuries. It wasn't suppressed until much later. And by the time that the suppression kind of came along in the 9th century, where Rome really moved into Ireland, where the Benedictines started taking over the monastics and the Augustinians eventually, etc., and it became very standardized, very Romanized. For hundreds of years before that, local traditions were kind of enculturated into that Irish Christianity. And that is a big difference from other places because they didn't see any need to suppress it. They would just incorporate it. This all kind of points to a reality, and there's sort of a one-liner that I heard from a professor of history in relation to Irish Christianity. Above all, unlike so many other Christian traditions at the frontiers of Roman and Christian practice, which were traditions which was a tradition that was brought and perpetuated to new lands by outsiders, the Irish converted themselves. Let me say that again. The Irish converted themselves. Patrick returned with that thread of the Christian lineage, but he started a new tradition. And Ireland, from the very beginning, set its own tone in terms of how it was going to practice Christianity, and it flourished. It flourished very quickly. It became a significant spiritual influence, and it became revered throughout the Christian world within a century for their copying abilities of manuscripts in the monasteries as educational institutions. Very ascetic and very rigid sort of practice, yet also flexible. Very decentralized, right? But also in a very tribal and clan-based, or what you'd expect from a tribal and clan-based sort of society, of which the early Christian tradition in Ireland was established. And like I said, eventually the practices of Ireland became revered, and then Irish Celtic Christianity lasted for a few hundred years, and then Rome came in about the 9th or 10th century. And by that time, then you get into councils, ecumenical councils like Lateran IV, which was in the 11th century, which really standardized a lot of practices, including priestly celibacy, standardized the Eucharist, the liturgy, that sort of thing, throughout Roman Catholicism, and really started to develop the central authority of the Pope in governing the Church as a whole. Anyway, long-winded way of saying, I think I was wrong about looking to Buddhist history to see how it transmitted through Asia over time. Instead, because I'm not in a traditionally Buddhist country, I think I almost need to look at our own cultural background and our own cultural, religious, spiritual ancestors for a model of how to proceed with establishing what might be a new Buddhist organism or a Buddhist tradition. And I think the Celtic Christian tradition in Ireland may be the template. In fact, as luck would have it, I have a strong Irish background. I actually qualify for an Irish passport. So the Irish roots run deep in my familial ancestry, and I would argue my spiritual ancestry, which is something that both of which are very strong in terms of Buddhist practice, is being aware of our blood and spiritual ancestors. This is part of mine. And so looking at this, I'm beginning to wonder whether the Irish Celtic Christian tradition from the 5th to the 9th centuries isn't actually the model that we should look to if we're establishing what could be considered a wilderness Buddhism, a frontier Buddhism, a Buddhism that sort of lives outside of the mainstream infrastructure, regardless of lineage and background of Buddhism, that draws on that tradition, that draws on that lineage for teachings and history and that sort of thing, but which is actually sort of doing its own thing. And Buddhism has a history of this, but Christianity also does. And like I said, I think this Irish Celtic Christian model might be the one to look to.